It all began with a rib-crushing embrace, though not the romantic kind. No, this particular constriction came courtesy of that most iconic symbol of Victorian beauty, the corset. A marvel of 19th century engineering and vanity, the corset was a tactile expression of one woman's quest to transform her midsection into a picturesque hourglass, and another woman's attempt to one-up her by shrinking hers further still, until breathing became a seasonal activity and digestion an elaborate performance piece. To fully appreciate the delightful absurdity of it all, we must first tiptoe gently into the well-mannered parlours of Victorian England, where fainting was fashionable, posture was power, and internal organs were considered flexible suggestions. Now imagine, it's the year 1842. Fog hangs lazily over the cobblestones, and a well-appointed lady is being fastened into her corset by a maid with the upper body strength of a circus strongman. Each tug of the tightly laced garment is punctuated by polite grunts, the occasional "right then," and an echoed shriek muffled by embroidery. The Victorian corset wasn't merely a fashion statement, it was practically body armor, if the battle was against free movement and healthy respiration. It could involve whalebone, steel busks, and more lacing than a particularly enthusiastic shoemaker's convention. And once adorned, it transformed the wearer into a statuesque vision of elegance, one that could neither bend fully at the waist nor properly consume a meal larger than a thimbleful of mashed peas. At the time, physicians, many of whom had never touched a laundry line, let alone a lace hook, began sounding the alarm in tones both somber and, occasionally, delightfully bonkers. One doctor, Robert L. Dickinson, writing slightly later but thinking very loudly for his day, feared that corset-induced displacement of vital organs could lead to disaster internally unguessable to the untrained observer. Translation: we're not entirely sure where the liver went, but it's probably not supposed to be lounging behind your shoulder blades. Victorian medical journals, those ever-sensible havens of polite hysteria, were splashed with articles titled "On the Injurious Effects of Corsets" and "A Treatise on Abdominal Compression in Ladies of Taste," often accompanied by anatomical drawings in which lungs appeared apologetic and the intestines politely shriveled into the corner like a shy guest at a tea party. Doctors weren't always in agreement, mind you. Some believed corsets caused tuberculosis, curved spines and moral decline, while others were simply baffled by how women managed to stand upright at all. Of course, Victorian society being what it was, a firm custard of outward modesty and quiet competition, many of these warnings were both whispered and widely ignored. After all, a woman couldn't have the second smallest waist in Surrey if she was also committed to breathing properly on a regular basis. Enter the corset tightening competitions, which were real. Yes, dear dreamer, there once existed soirees where women would gather to out-constrict each other. Feet planted, arms raised, and breathe in, darling. No, further. The maid pulls, the stays tighten, and somewhere in the drawing room, another young lady swoons dramatically into a fern. But lest we think the Victorians lacked preventative health measures entirely, I must tell you about the respiratory reform crowd. These were the radicals who proposed corsets with adjustable tension, looser fittings, or gasp, none at all. One reformer even proposed a health corset, which, like a diet cookie or a polite guillotine, was neither here nor there. There were lectures held in dusty church halls, complete with diagrams of poor Clara, whose stomach had migrated south during her third ball of the season. Dignified gentlemen trained in the art of medicine stood behind podiums, and gravely informed rooms full of swooning silhouettes that compressing the lungs might well reduce not just oxygen intake, but the very will to live. And yet, the fashion held firm. Laced tighter than society's expectations, corsets remained en vogue, far past the moment the writing was, metaphorically, on the wallpaper. Even Queen Victoria herself, that high priestess of grim lace and national stability, was suspected to have worn a corset resolute enough to separate beans by density. She never publicly denounced them, though to be fair, she didn't publicly denounce much unless it involved anarchists or improperly made jam. As you float a little deeper into your pillow nest, consider this. It's 3 a.m. in Victorian London. A woman stares into her vanity mirror, her waist trussed to near mythical proportions. Outside, a doctor writes by candlelight, warning about the dangers of fashion and breath. And the maid. She's quietly nursing biceps that would startle a Greco-Roman wrestler. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now close your eyes gently and we'll press onward, one rib at a time. The year is 1859. The steam engine is puffing along like a determined grandmother with a parasol and no patience. England smells faintly of boiled cabbage, and Queen Victoria has recently declared herself Empress of almost everything. It is also, rather inconveniently, the peak of the corset era, a time in which women voluntarily allowed themselves to be gently disciplined by a series of whalebones, ribbons, and the weight of society's expectations. Ah yes, the corset, a garment so tightly laced it could allegedly rearrange your internal organs in the pursuit of elegance. Medicine at the time, still developing its relationship with cleanliness and common sense, had a few opinions about this. Enter the Victorian doctor. Now, your average Victorian physician was typically male, mustachioed, and possessed an extraordinary sense of self-confidence, despite not yet having access to either antibiotics or much in the way of factual anatomy. Of course, this did not stop them from having very strong opinions about the female form, and what should, or more importantly, should not, be done to it. One such concern was what the professionals called corset liver. This was not, as it might sound, a niche meat dish served in obscure gourmet circles, but rather the alleged displacement of the liver due to excessive tight lacing. Yes, the liver, a normally sedentary and respectable organ, was accused of wandering off toward the pelvis under pressure from an earnest desire for a 17-inch waistline. Autopsies, occasionally performed with terrifying enthusiasm, showed that organs had indeed been nudged somewhat from their usual geographic coordinates. But let us not rush. To understand the medical warning signs that Victorian doctors so desperately tried to communicate through layers of misunderstanding and mutton chops, one must picture the consultation itself. Imagine a drawing room. The wallpaper is floral and slightly intoxicated with arsenic-based dyes. The woman sits, adjusting her bustle slightly, while the doctor brandishes a stethoscope with the air of a man about to listen for gossip inside someone's chest cavity. "My dear Mrs. Pringleton," he might begin, "I regret to inform you that your spleen appears to be flirting quite improperly with your lower intestine. Has your corset been tighter than usual?" Mrs. Pringleton, ever the polite hostess, pretends to ponder while secretly wondering if it's poor digestion or simply the 7 scones she ate before breakfast. Doctors warned of other horrors too: shortness of breath, fainting spells, and something called hysteria, which was the Victorian catch-all term for women behaving in literally any unscheduled manner, feeling moody. Hysteria. Laughing too freely. Hysteria. Reading French novels without adult supervision. Utter, uncontrollable hysteria. Much of this, they claimed, could stem from corset use. Tight lacing was suspected of squashing the lungs until a lady could only breathe in size, which, granted, was considered fairly fashionable. So perhaps it was hard to tell where symptom ended and style began. One doctor famously lamented that women were turning themselves into human hourglasses at the price of skeletal resignation. Rib bones were gradually coerced into a new shape, a literal reshaping of the self for social approval, all while morphing into the desired figure of the day, the porcelain dolly. Oh, and digestion. Best not to bring it up. Let's just say that with everything squeezed quite tightly into unnatural positions, one's intestines ceased to be enthusiastic about anything. Meals were smaller, appetite flatter, and the general sensation not unlike trying to eat pudding while being gently but insistently hugged by a python. Yet in the bustling world of Victorian high society, fashion rarely bowed to function. A neatly cinched waist was worth, apparently, more than a fully functioning diaphragm. And thus the doctors continued to issue gentle warnings into the void, like anxious uncles at a formal dance, hoping someone, anyone, would loosen a few ribbons for the sake of their pancreas. Yet women persisted. Not necessarily because they enjoyed breathing shallowly or reorganizing their spleens, but because in an odd and deeply infuriating way, corsetry was also linked to power, albeit the kind one performs within. To be well-dressed, well-waisted, and socially correct, well, that could earn you access, admiration, even status. Comfort, that was negotiable, so the tension quietly wound tighter between health and fashion, freedom and expectation, lace and logic. Somewhere in an overstuffed London drawing room, a young lady adjusted her corset with practiced fingers, smiled faintly, and fainted decoratively. And in the next room, her mother whispered to the physician, "She's simply overcome with excitement." The physician nodded gravely, recorded it under hysteria, and went back to polishing his stethoscope with a monogrammed handkerchief. But not all women submitted. Behind those tightly laced silhouettes, something else was beginning. A quiet rebellion in silk slippers. We'll sit back now. Sink deeper into the candle-lit shadows and listen as the whispers begin. It all started with a simple whisper. A whisper of compression, curves, and control. Somewhere in the flickering gaslight of the early 19th century, corsets took a sharp turn from shaping undergarments to architectural marvels of physique manipulation. And, as with all great architectural undertakings, there were consequences. Enormous ones, squishy ones, and occasionally fainting on the parlor floor ones. By the 1830s, corsets had grown dramatically more ambitious. What began in earlier centuries as a sort of supportive bodice had now become a rib-caging, belly-defying, spine-stiffening contraption. Picture this: a broad, tightly laced garment made from whalebone, heavy canvas, and reinforced stitching that could cinch the waist until one could nearly pass through a keyhole sideways. Or at least, that was the hope. The Victorian aesthetic demanded it, and polite society did not negotiate with bones. Of course, the doctors of the day began to notice oddities. Women came to them pale, short of breath, unable to laugh without coughing dramatically, and prone to spontaneous swooning. The usual diagnosis: female troubles, a wonderfully vague umbrella term that Victorian practitioners used when they didn't actually know what was wrong, but suspected the uterus was somehow involved. Spoiler alert, they always suspected the uterus was involved. Still, a few brave medical men stepped up, not to champion women's rights, mind you, but to defend the noble anatomy from being squeezed like an overripe plum. One such man was Dr. Robert Tomlinson Banks, a physician known for his deep concern, tragic sideburns, and fondness for alarming metaphors. He once compared tightlacing to attempting to store wine in a concertina. The analogy made questionable anatomical sense, but he delivered it with such trembling conviction that ladies fainted just hearing it, though some of them may have simply needed a rest from their corsets. Dr. Tomlinson Banks and his colleagues noticed that certain problems followed corset lovers like an overly dramatic shadow at a candlelit ball: displaced organs, shallow breathing, digestive disorders, and the absolute inability to bend over in a socially graceful way. Rather than realizing this was a sign to rethink undergarment design, many fashion-conscious women simply hired more servants to pick up anything they happened to drop. There were also the issue of floating ribs, the bottom pair or two of ribs that are not attached to the breastbone and are therefore inconveniently movable. Some fashionable women, desperate for smaller waists, sought to compress their ribs into an hourglass silhouette worthy of admiration at any garden party. And yes, some even claimed their corsets had permanently reshaped their bones. One must admire the Victorian commitment to suffering for beauty. It's very nearly spiritual. Doctors, society whispered with a faint glimmer of concern, say corsets may impede one's breathing. But society also whispered, louder and with more lace, it's better to faint elegantly than breathe normally with a 28-inch waist. One woman allegedly said, I would rather be lovely and breathless than plain and puffing, before collapsing on a chintz ottoman with exquisite timing. Magazine columns and medical journals started grumbling about the epidemic of tightlacing. Cartoons mocked it. Novels poked fun of it. But like all good fashion trends with damaging internal consequences, corsets held on valiantly. The power of a tiny waist in a world of social expectation was, apparently, worth the occasional lack of oxygen. Even Queen Victoria herself, emblem of national dignity and stern expressions, wore corsets. These royal undergarments, of course, were less pathologically tight than those worn by young debutantes hoping to be mistaken for an hourglass wrapped in velvet. But still, if the Queen's waist could be shaped daily with cord and steel, what hope did a mere milkmaid have? Eventually, some physicians went to print, trying in their own scholarly way to explain that perhaps internal bleeding, fainting, irregular heartbeats, and being unable to eat more than half a boiled egg at a time might be signs of structural displeasure from within. But as everyone knew, men might write medical papers, but women read fashion plates. And fashion plates spoke a language of cinched little waists, ballooning skirts, and graceful distortions. So despite the coughs, spasms, and occasional incidents of spontaneous floorward collapse, Victorian women continued lacing up, drawing in, and hoping that their dresses and their dignity would hold fast. Besides, no one wanted to be accused of having a natural figure. That way lay scandal. In a drawing room somewhere, a lady daintily adjusted her bonnet, took a shallow breath, and sipped half a thimbleful of broth. And somewhere else, a young doctor stared at a diagram of thoracic compression and wondered, quite earnestly, if the lungs could be trained like polite children. A new chapter in corset history was being laced into place, tighter than ever and with stiffer boning. As the fashions stiffened, so too did the resolve of Victorian women to breathe as little as possible, and do it beautifully. There are many things one might expect to find in the office of a Victorian doctor, but a tape measure, some smelling salts, and a half-wilted fern named Bernardu paint a rather typical picture. These fine practitioners of 19th century medicine hovered somewhere between curious philosophers and increasingly anxious tailors, and few patients inspired more collective brow-furrowing than the corset-clad woman who arrived gasping, fainting, and occasionally, though very discreetly, leaking bile. For physicians of the mid-1800s, corsets were both a professional mystery and a polite social scandal. You see, the body was supposed to be a mechanism, like a pocket watch or a gentleman's digestive tract, neatly wound, occasionally over-lubricated, and largely reliant on invisible mechanisms. But corsets scrambled this mechanical metaphor into something more accordion-like. Young women, particularly from the upper crust, that flaky pastry of society, would stride into surgeries looking like hourglasses on legs, accompanied by mothers who eyed the nearest fainting couch with proprietary concern. These ladies, charmingly breathless and tinted slightly blue, would sit decorously with a gloved hand to the forehead and confess to symptoms such as a general listlessness, a tightness under the liver, or the widely accepted diagnosis known simply as the vapors. Now, the vapors was Victorian for "we haven't the faintest clue," a medical umbrella under which a whole tea trolley of ailments lived comfortably. Hysteria, melancholy, nymphomania, unsuitable opinions. There was room for all. But the corset was suspected to be the culprit behind many such complaints, particularly those involving organs that had, shall we say, shifted ranks. One particularly observant doctor, Dr. William S. Playfair, took the liberty of sketching what he believed the female anatomy looked like before and after the application of a tight corset. His diagrams show something between a Victorian torso and a squashed fruit trifle. The liver originally snug beneath the ribcage, appears in the after version as if deciding to take a holiday toward the left armpit. The intestines, naturally shy and reclusive creatures, had retreated to form what experts might now call a softly panicked pile. But medicine in those days was a genteel blend of science, social commentary, and pure guesswork. One medical journal published in 1874 declared that corsets were surely displacing the uterus from its God-ordained position, though quite how the authors determined the celestial coordinates for uterine preference was not elaborated. Still, the conclusion was ominous. Displaced wombs, they claimed, led to displaced morals, and by the logic of frightened 19th century men, a misaligned uterus was practically an invitation to absinthe and atheism. Not that anyone quite agreed on what organs did. Some doctors were still convinced that the female brain was simply not designed for complex thought, or indeed for being covered by a brimmed hat. But when it came to corsets, they could all align on one firm, cinched point. This was a medical nuisance, and more alarmingly, a social fashion that refused to loosen its stays. Of course, many women didn't mind the warnings. Far from wilting violets, they were entirely aware that beauty demanded nonsense. Being only barely able to breathe was a small price to pay for the covetable S-shaped figure. Besides, if suffering in silence was a skill, Victorian women were virtuosos. Pain was endured, and sometimes even savoured, presented with a casual shrug and the confident whisper that it was simply part of being properly dressed. Occasionally, however, the cost became harder to hide. Autopsies began showing distortions, livers with chew marks from ribs, spinal twists that read like cursive, and stomachs doing their best impressions of a gentleman's necktie. One infamous dissection presented a heart that had nestled so tightly against the breastbone it needed a moment to be unstuck, presumably with a butter knife and polite apology. Doctors released pamphlets, gently suggesting that perhaps corsetry ought to be loosened, just a tad, just an inch. They wrote speeches addressed to society ladies and lady societies. Some even whispered radical beliefs that breathing regularly was preferable to having a 20-inch waist. But change, like petticoats, comes in layers. And the corset, defiant, romantic, deadly, still gripped the ribs of fashion with stubborn grace. Now, as gas lamps flicker low and the scent of lavender mothballs settles on velvet chairs, we draw the drapery beside one more question. What role did women themselves play in defending their corsets in spite of doctors, organs, and inconvenience? Well, let's just say they had their reasons. Now, let us drift a little deeper, past the bustle of horse-drawn carriages and the quiet rattle of bone china at tea time, into the peculiar concerns of one particular group of Victorian citizens, the medical professionals. Yes, the good doctors, those pillars of stiff-collared intellect and unshakable conviction, furiously scribbling notes with ink-stained fingers while peering suspiciously at the shape of women's silhouettes. By the mid-1800s, advances in medicine had reached such heights that leeches were no longer the only answer to everything. Some physicians, clever ones with spectacles bigger than their egos, began to worry that lacing one's midsection into an hourglass might not, in fact, be ideal for human organs. It turns out the human body isn't designed to be gently rearranged like a decorative floral arrangement. Enter Dr. William Henry Flower, whose name sounds appropriately botanical for a man warning people not to squeeze their rib cages so tightly they resemble a Victorian vase. Dr. Flower, a respected anatomist, dared to do the unthinkable. He studied female skeletons. Not in a creepy way. He was genuinely concerned. And in public lectures, he began showing two skeletons side by side. One left undisturbed by fashion, and the other, well, the other's ribs had been politely folded inward by prolonged corsethood. One such lecture caused a small scandal when it was attended by mixed company. The very notion that a woman's undergarments could be discussed openly in a public forum sent several monocles tumbling into cups of weak tea. A gentleman in the second row reportedly fainted, not from the anatomical horrors, but from the idea that someone said rib cage in front of ladies. Still, some doctors began documenting the strange array of ailments they believed corsets were causing in their patients. There was neurasthenia, a rather catch-all term for everything from general fatigue to emotional overflow, because when a woman exhibited too many feelings, better just diagnose the whole bundle and offer her some quiet convalescence. But then came more specific complaints: fainting fits, palpitations, shallow breathing, indigestion, and a mysterious phenomenon known charmingly as the floating kidney. Apparently, if you squeeze the abdomen just right, or terribly wrong, you really can encourage a kidney to wander slightly off its designated shelf. And although that sounds like the sort of thing Victorian doctors might have dreamed up between puffs of opium-laced cough syrup, they were quite insistent. One rather dramatic physician published an article claiming that corsets had caused grievous displacement of the liver in several of his most fashion-forward patients. Grievous, no less. Though he did not explain how he determined the liver to be aggrieved, we must assume he either had X-ray vision or a very persuasive stethoscope. It wasn't only internal organs voicing their silent complaints. Lungs, that oft-neglected set of bellows, also made their concerns felt. Or unfelt, depending on how tightly you were laced. A well-laced corset could reduce lung capacity by nearly a third, which made deep breathing an ambitious pursuit. Small wonder all those fainting couches were worn in at the edges. Victorian women weren't necessarily fragile, they just couldn't breathe. But still, in parlours across Britain, tight lacing continued. Because while doctors might scribble and scold, fashion remained a more persuasive authority. A stern warning from the Royal College of Physicians carried less weight than a compliment at a ball. For every article warning against spinal curvature and rib deformity, there were a dozen fashion magazines serenading the hourglass ideal. Only a few particularly spirited physicians ventured further, suggesting laws, proposing public lectures, and generally being ignored. Some wrote open letters to mothers, imploring them not to bind their daughters' waists, lest they grow up pale and breathless as lilies kept from the sun. And while poetic, it's hard to say how persuasive botanic metaphors were in the face of social expectations, matchmaking, and Queen Victoria's own rather cinched royal silhouette. Yet one cannot help but admire these early medics, earnest, awkward men in wool suits, trying to rescue women's health with diagrams and integrity, whispering warnings into the storm of silk and satin and side-eye disapproval. It was, in many ways, a quiet act of rebellion, charting the physiology of fashion in the lamplight. And just beyond their consulting rooms and anatomical lectures, another noise was gathering, the softly rustling movement of change. A different voice would soon be heard, quieter than a medical journal, but stronger than a cinch cord, one that came not from the physicians, but from the wearers of the corsets themselves. In the velvety hush of a parlour, permeated with lavender pomade and overcooked cabbage, Victorian women sucked in their breath, quite literally, for the cause of fashion. By the 1860s, corsets had evolved into something vaguely resembling medieval siege equipment, except lace-trimmed and socially acceptable at tea. As ladies laced up with military precision, Victorian doctors started murmuring difficulties, penning ominous warnings with ink-stained fingers and slightly nervous moustaches. Dr. William Henry Flower, a fine gentleman with a name longer than most of his diagnoses, took one look at the fashionable hourglass silhouette and promptly declared, "That's not natural," which, to be fair, was accurate. The human waistline prefers to remain internally attached to its organs, not bisected into the shape of an opera glass. Still, vanity persisted, and so did Dr. Flower, who spent a good many afternoons lecturing on the perils of squashed spleens and startled stomachs. But Dr. Flower wasn't alone in his belly-based battle cry. Enter Dr. Thomas Inman, a man who tried very hard to explain in well-mannered medicals journals that compressing the liver was not an ideal way to secure one's place in polite society. His warnings, though detailed, mostly fell on tightly laced ears. After all, it's hard to focus on hepatic inflammation when your main concern is whether your waist will still fit under your gown, at Lady Prattlesworth's Tuesday salon. Then there was Dr. Ludovic O'Ferrall, a splendidly named fellow who genuinely believed corsets were turning women into emotional time bombs. According to O'Ferrall, the restrictions of tightlacing led not only to respiratory difficulty, but also to moral deterioration, making corsets, apparently, both a fashion item and a pathway to ruin. One can picture him, trembling with Victorian anxiety, staring at a young woman's aggressively cinched waist and whispering, "There goes her virtue." Now, before we scoff too heartily at the good doctors, many of them were onto something. Medical illustrations from the time show corset distortions of the body that could give an anatomist pause and a tailor nightmares. The ribs curved like parentheses, and organs performed an unfortunate game of musical chairs. Still, for every impassioned doctor shouting into the wind, there was a fashion magazine whispering, "A 16-inch waist is the epitome of elegance." And really, who's going to listen to the man with the stethoscope when Godey's Ladies' Book just published a new sketch of Princess Louise looking like a delicately carved candlestick? While the medical field wrung its hands, some corset companies tried to defend their wares with the kind of logic that would make a modern science teacher weep gently into their beaker. Advertisements claimed that corsets actually improved posture, aided digestion, and, my personal favorite, protected against sudden jostling. Yes, in an age before airbags or bike helmets, women apparently depended on their undergarments to function as bodily potpourri and rudimentary armor. How? Comforting. Even Queen Victoria's physician, Sir William Gull, occasionally weighed in. He was a very weighing-in sort of man, admitting with all the delicacy of the court that, yes, perhaps rib reshaping wasn't terribly sound from a medical standpoint. Still, he stopped short of declaring corsets a national emergency, possibly because doing so might disrupt tea time, and nothing came between the Victorians and their tea, not even an imploding gallbladder. Women, of course, were not passive participants in this girdling theatre. Many wrote letters to newspapers defending their right to fashion, even if it involved slight artistic rearrangements of their intestines. A well-known socialite once proclaimed she had worn a corset every day since she was 13 and had never had a single ill effect, other than fainting occasionally while climbing stairs, which is good for one's mystique. Fair enough. Others, in quieter defiance, adjusted their lacing just a tad looser when their mothers weren't looking, or only wore their stiffest stays to events where the candles were bright and gossip was particularly juicy. Even the rebels among the laced-up elite knew that sometimes fashion demanded a bit of sacrifice, and perhaps one or two displaced kidneys. So while the physicians issued warning after warning, and the corset companies swirled about in clouds of perfumed advertisements, the average Victorian woman simply did what women have always done. She navigated her day, her expectations, and her wardrobe with grace, cleverness, and just enough breath to make it from breakfast to supper without keeling over entirely. And somewhere, under layers of lace and linen, the body made do, whispering secret protests the way only lungs wrapped in whalebone can. Somewhere not far from this tale of ribs and resistance, a new chapter drifts softly into view, one sewn with silk threads, stiffened with satire, and quietly stitched with the choices women made just out of sight. Imagine, if you will, the year is 1864. Gas lamps flicker on London's fogged-up corners, horse-drawn carriages clatter over cobbled streets, and there's a faint smell of boiled cabbage trailing out of a boarding house window. Now, within these corset-laced times, we arrive at the drawing room of one Miss Cordelia Featherstone, aged 23, known for her dramatic fainting style and unparalleled ability to write poems about melancholy clouds. Cordelia had begun to experience what she described as a mysterious constriction about the chest, accompanied by occasional breath-stealing euphoria and a deep, philosophical longing for sea air. Her doctor, a gentleman called Basil Witherington Smythe, decided to investigate. Dr. Witherington Smythe was known across at least 3 postal districts for his authoritative sideburns and pioneering theories on female nervous disposition caused by unchecked wallpaper patterns. He had in his medical teeth bag 4 essential tools: his brass stethoscope, a bottle of laudanum, a copy of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, and an unshakable suspicion that corsets were somehow involved in most of his female patients' ailments. Though admittedly, the real cause could also be the damp. Upon examining Miss Featherstone's corset, an impressive arrangement of 32 whalebones, crisscrossing laces, and spiritual repression, Dr. Witherington Smythe issued his prognosis. "My dear, you are suffering from fashionable strangulation." This term, though colourfully dramatic, was not entirely made up. A number of Victorian physicians, some of them even sober, began expressing very real concerns about the internal havoc caused by tightly laced corsets. The organs, they noted rather nervously, didn't like musical chairs. The liver, which prefers to remain stationary, had begun migrating. The stomach, in protest, sometimes attempted acrobatics. Lungs, those fragile bellows of the human machine, found themselves squished like overpacked valises on holiday. Medical journals of the time, such as The Lancet, began to publish articles with titles like "On the Morbid Displacement of the Abdominal Viscera in Young Ladies of Fashionable Habits." It was less of a cure, more of a polite warning. Still, most doctors walked a delicate line. Criticizing the corset outright was akin to blaming tea for sleeplessness. Unthinkable. Fashion, after all, had its own hierarchy, immune to mere science. Even Queen Victoria's daughter, the Princess Royal, had once remarked that tight-lacing was a moral practice that built discipline and posture, and possibly a vague sense of superiority. Nonetheless, the concerned medical community began attempting subtle interventions. Pamphlets were printed. Ladies' gazettes recommended rational dress reform, which included initiatives like the slightly looser corset, or, scandalously, bloomers. One alarming suggestion involved abandoning the corset entirely for certain hours of the day. This, however, was only suitable for the gravely ill, or women living in spiritual communes who read too much Shelley. An especially spirited group of physicians in Edinburgh formed what they called the Association for the Advancement of Rational Dress, which sounds charmingly bureaucratic until one realizes that their meetings often devolved into heated arguments over the exact tolerance of organ compression and the aesthetic sins of ruffled sleeves. Meanwhile, Miss Featherstone, still the muse of drawing-room dramatics, took to composing verses about her corset-induced torpor. A local journal published her poem, Ode to the Boning in My Bosom, which, while emotionally potent, was medically confusing. Dr. Witherington Smythe offered her a prescription of sensible breathing exercises, light strolls in the fog, and a corset with adaptive whalebone curvature that he had personally designed with the help of his housekeeper and an old umbrella. Cordelia tried it for 3 days before returning to her old corset, citing the agony of her silhouette appearing merely nice rather than sculpted in the image of Venus in a huff. In truth, fashion would win this battle for several more decades, with medical concerns politely ignored, shelved, or labelled unladylike. The human body would continue its quiet internal protest as doctors grumbled politely, and poets like Miss Featherstone sighed wistfully into the mist. And yet, somewhere in those candlelit parlours, in the faint rustle of silk and stays, a new idea had begun to flicker, gentle as a match in a rainstorm. An idea far more radical than abandoning your corset altogether. But we'll press the laces a little looser and drift toward that tomorrow. A curious thing happened around the drawing rooms and dining halls of 1860s England. Quietly, and with the most delicate coughs behind lace handkerchiefs, women began fainting with such regularity that manufacturers of settees subtly reinforced their furniture. Yes, among the violet waters and crinolines, swooning took its place as a perfectly acceptable interruption to afternoon tea. Now, some claimed it was the excitement of seeing Lord Davenport's sideburns in the sunlight, or the strain of absorbing yet another piano sonata from a cousin too eager with the pedal. But others, the ones with brass-rimmed spectacles and medical degrees forged in cautious Latin, began to murmur another possibility. Those whispers came from Victorian doctors, and they all pointed to one silent, laced-up culprit: the corset. Corsets, if you're unfamiliar, were essentially ribcage prisons wrapped in silk. With strong moral convictions and even stronger whalebone, they hugged women's waists so tightly it made breathing a suggestion rather than a skill. The idea was to create the ideal silhouette, a waist so tiny one could, according to fashion magazines of the day, encircle it with a gentleman's hands. Note: this becomes less romantic when one considers said gentleman probably had gout and hands damp with mutton grease. Physicians began to speak up in that most Victorian way, politely, cautiously, and always laden with metaphors involving bellows or sausages. Dr. William Henry Flower, a surgeon with a name as proper as his moustache, delivered lectures that compared the female torso to a cathedral's arch. He warned that if you tampered with the architecture, well, don't be surprised if the entire congregation collapsed. He wasn't wrong. Dissections revealed that organs rearranged themselves under corset pressure with the enthusiasm of party guests trying to escape a parlor filled with lute music. The liver nudged over, the stomach compressed like a folded napkin, and ribs sometimes bent inwards like the branches of a well-trained bonsai. And yet, fashion was unstoppable. Not unlike a determined hedgehog crossing a country lane. Women heard the warnings, but they also heard the rustle of taffeta, the click of boning hooks, and the soft social threat of being deemed frumpy, which was Victorian slang for person one doesn't write poems about. Medical men tried a different tactic. If anatomical drawings couldn't sway the ladies, perhaps they could terrify them instead. Pamphlets appeared with titles such as "On the Deformities Induced by the Practice of Tightlacing," which, to be fair, sounded more like a Gothic novel than a medical treatise. Engravings showed skeletons misshapen by years of fashionable bondage, ribcages warped into uncanny tulip shapes, pelvises listing sideways like a tired bookshelf. Still, for every pamphlet delivered with dire warnings, there was another advertisement promising that Missy Whitby had won the admiration of half the town, strictly through the elegance of her 17-inch waist. And then there were the corset injuries. Oh yes, corset-related accidents made the medical journals, squeezed between entries on spontaneous combustion and the dangers of catching foreign accents. A young lady in Bath fell into the garden and couldn't get up, not out of injury, but because her corset was so tight, she lacked the core mobility of a garden statue. Another woman reportedly experienced a sudden snap, followed by a fatigue so overwhelming she mistook it for spiritual enlightenment, only to find her corset busk had broken and narrowly missed her spleen. Some doctors, perhaps out of exasperation, began recommending rational dress, an idea as warmly received as kale at a cake sale. The Rational Dress Society emerged in the 1880s, lobbying for less restrictive clothing and more breathable options, like loose bodices and bloomers. Bloomers, however, were not a hit. They were worn primarily by women who also enjoyed writing stern letters to the editor and leading brisk walks at inconvenient hours. However, the seeds were planted. The public had heard enough murmured warnings, drawn enough twisted ribcages, and dislodged enough innards to begin wondering, just possibly, if fashion should allow for full lung expansion. Still, even as the medical community grew louder, the world of high society clung to its corsets. After all, nothing quite captured the Victorian spirit like a garment that promised moral superiority while cutting off most circulation south of the clavicle. And so, the corset lingered, cinched, stitched, and oddly glorified, as both scapegoat and symbol, medical menace, and stylish necessity. Yet something was stirring, ever so faintly, behind the velvet curtains and embroidered fans, a change that would come not in sudden rebellion, but in comfortable, cotton-covered steps. A new vision of womanhood was beginning to unlace itself. The foggy streets of 1850s London may have teemed with soot and scandal, but inside the parlor rooms of the respectable middle class, a different kind of crisis simmered, one less likely to involve pickpockets and more likely to include fainting onto the nearest chaise lounge. It was, of course, the corset. And while fashionable ladies cinched their waists and sighed deeply, with both longing and lack of oxygen, their doctors nervously tapped their ink-stained fingers over case reports and handwritten pamphlets warning, in earnest Victorian concern, that women's insides were, quite possibly, migrating. Now, before we tuck into tea with skeletal diagrams and digestive complaints, let's talk context. The Victorian physician was not, as one might wish, a calming presence with bedside manner and herbal lozenges. He was more likely to sport a handlebar moustache, believe in phrenology, and take his cues from ancient Rome. If your spleen hurt, he might prescribe a mustard poultice and a good bleeding. If your corset made you faint on the daily, he would wag his finger and write a letter to a medical journal. At the time, Britain's male doctors were increasingly vocal, not always in harmony, and certainly not always in reason, about the so-called dangers of tightlacing. This practice, beloved by aristocrats and aspiring debutantes alike, involved pulling the corset strings so snug it could reduce the waist by several inches. The appeal? A wasp waist silhouette that made any wearer look as though they were about to be married off in a Bronte novel. But behind closed doors, or rather, doctors' surgeries with fainting chairs and questionable hygiene, concern was mounting. Dr. William Henry Flower, a gentleman with both a surname and occupation, better suited to a humble greenhouse, warned in 1881 that corsets displaced and compressed the internal viscera in alarming fashion. In simple terms, organs were apparently squished, shuffled, and encouraged to behave badly. The stomach tucked upward, the liver flattened, the lungs encroached upon. One physician claimed that habitual tightlacing could nearly bisect the liver like a sharp knife over time. Charming imagery for a bedtime tale, I know. But remember, even the diagrams came with ribbons. Understandably, these medical concerns gave rise to a peculiar genre of public health campaigning, corset reform literature. Doctors published intricate pamphlets with lovely cursive titles like The Corset as a Cause of Disease, in which women's clothing, not syphilis or child labor, was presented as society's most urgent medical emergency. And here, dear listener, lies the contradiction at the heart of Victorian medicine. The very same doctors who warned against the corset were sometimes the ones prescribing it. For some young women described as languid or troublesome, a support corset was advised to cure spinal listlessness or a general case of female mischief, an ailment known only to sound vaguely disapproving. The era's favorite catch-all diagnosis, hysteria, was often blamed on an unruly uterus, thought to wander through the body like a ghost uncertain of its afterlife. When women complained of exhaustion, loss of appetite, breathlessness, or an inability to concentrate, having perhaps just completed a dinner party in a 17-inch corset, their concerns were conveniently rounded up into the diagnosis pile of too fanciful or nerves. Meanwhile, the women themselves weren't simply passive victims in a grand medical melodrama. Many wrote emphatically, and often satirically, about their corsetry. Some even argued for it as a form of control, a means of achieving beauty, self-discipline, refinement. A tight waist sent a message. Unfortunately, it also sometimes sent the gallbladder slightly sideways. Still, the more progressive physicians of mid-century found allies in a subtle revolution. Dress reformers, suffragists, and sensible aunts joined the chorus, calling for looser clothing and less rib-caging fashion. The Rational Dress Society, formed in 1881, declared war on swaddling, women in millinery torture. They proposed clothing that allowed for breathing, walking, and possibly, heaven forbid, thinking. Of course, no movement changed fashion overnight, especially one waging intellectual war against velvet piping and social expectation. But the doctor's warnings hit just enough journals and drawing rooms to become late-night whisper fodder. "Did you hear," young ladies would murmur, "that a woman's heart moved slightly to the left because of her corset? Possibly, probably not. But who are we to argue with science that came with footnotes and a monocle? And so, As Britain's medical profession fretted over misplaced intestines and women tiptoed the line between elegance and oxygen, the quiet uprising against the corset was underway. Next, we'll gently wander into the curious matter of corset-related technology, screws, steels, and the ever-mysterious ventilated model. Yes, even the Victorians dabbled in breathable fashion, sort of. Inside a genteel drawing room somewhere in Belgravia, two women in fashionable tea dresses sat across from one another, sipping from porcelain cups painted with roses. A spring breeze swirled through parted curtains, and a faint scent of lavender wafted in from the street. All seemed calm, but beneath their bodices, revolution brewed. And not of the political sort. No, this uprising involved half a lung's worth of breath and a pair of very squashed kidneys. By the mid-Victorian era, corsets had morphed from supportive bodice to tool of architectural ambition. Terrifyingly ambitious, in fact. Waistlines weren't simply narrowed, they were cinched, coaxed, and, on occasion, threatened into submission. Medical professionals of the time, mostly men with mutton chops and strong opinions, began to take alarm. They peered at X-rays, well, not yet, scribbled in journals with names like The Lancet, and warned the population with increasing urgency. Ladies, you are collapsing your livers. Of course, Victorian medicine wasn't always the beacon of science one might hope. This was, after all, the same century in which doctors vigorously debated whether reading too many novels could dislodge a woman's uterus. Still, their corset concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Enter Dr. William Henry Flower, a man with the dual misfortune of having a serious medical career and also being named vaguely like a boutique florist. Dr. Flower, ever the anatomist, took a special interest in female torsos. In 1882, he staged a lecture for the Royal Institution entitled Fashion in Deformity. Not the sort of thing you'd expect to find on a late-night infomercial, but perhaps worth tuning in if you like skeletons and righteous indignation. During his talk, Dr. Flower showcased human rib cages distorted beyond recognition by years of tightlacing. There's always something dramatic about a man holding a rib cage aloft to make a point, and indeed, onlookers were suitably scandalized. The bones curved inward in a way suggesting not so much dainty hourglass as accordion caught in a hot car. Doctors were particularly vexed by what today we'd call organ displacement. Corsets could, over time, nudge the liver downward, compress the stomach, and scoot one's intestines into places intestines don't particularly enjoy being. The lungs. Let's just say they were not living their best lives. And yet, paradoxically, corsets were also prescribed for health. A woman struggling with hysteria, which could mean anything from mild irritability to being just a bit too good at math, might be advised to wear a sturdier corset to straighten her posture and return her to good humor. The logic, if you can call it that, was that internal chaos could be soothed by external firmness, which is very Victorian and also very incorrect. Some doctors even attempted to design health corsets. These were said to support without compressing, though in normal practice they resembled a lycra-free contradiction. The idea was noble, the execution mangled. Most designs still featured steel boning and lace-up closures, like someone trying to make a shark cage comfortable. But not all women were passively laced and squeezed. Some began to push back, albeit gently, as any vigorous shoving would require oxygen. Letters to newspapers, pamphlets from women's reform leagues, and whispered drawing room protests fed an underground resistance against the tyranny of grommets and whalebone. Whisper it softly, but by the 1870s, some women were even leaving off corsets altogether while at home. Scandalous. Still, society moved glacially, and fashion rarely admits defeat on the first try. Doctors kept writing articles, some complete with cautionary diagrams. One particularly melodramatic illustration showed a corset literally squeezing a woman's waist into an hourglass so narrow it could theoretically fit through the bars of a birdcage, which sounds like nonsense. And yet, metaphorically, perhaps it wasn't far off. Meanwhile, fashion magazines continued to print silhouettes suggesting the average woman had a waist comparable in circumference to a teacup. Simply, the latest Parisian charm, chirped the captions, carefully avoiding any mention of abdominal strangulation. Eventually, physicians stopped alarming the public and started designing underwear. The Rational Dress Society was founded, and people began thinking perhaps one could support one's figure and vital organs at the same time. But reform is never simple, especially when built on the twin pillars of science and taffeta. As the hour grows late and the breeze shifts toward dusk, let us gently dim the gas lamp and follow the scent of camphor and starch as another layer peels away from this tightly laced tale. It was the year 1861, and somewhere in the elegant drawing rooms of London, amidst the rustle of taffeta and the soothing gurgle of a distant tea, trolley. The medical profession had begun whispering its discontent, not with the usual suspects, arsenic wallpaper, spontaneous combustion, or women reading novels in sunlight, but with corsets, those rigid bodices of boning and bravado designed to sculpt the Victorian female figure into a fashionable question mark. By then, fashion was synonymous with physics-defying anatomy. Women's waists were cinched small enough to make one wonder, not entirely jokingly, how their organs found room to coexist. Dr. William Henry Flower, esteemed anatomist and occasional buzzkill at fashionable soirees, once declared that corsets rearranged internal organs like items on a crowded shelf. Livers nudged kidneys with passive-aggressive urgency, and intestines sulked in corners like uninvited guests. But if elite London society feared anything more than misaligned viscera, it was being caught in last season's silhouette. The doctors, valiantly if somewhat awkwardly, tried to mount a campaign. They published earnest pamphlets with long titles and longer footnotes. The corset, as a cause of functional displacement of the uterus, was a particular page-turner. These tracts warned against corset liver, corset heart, and the truly alarming corset hysteria, which sounded like a medical condition but was more of a general panic caused by being unable to sit, breathe, or eat toast without assistance. Women, for their part, nodded politely at the warnings while continuing to lace themselves in with admirable tenacity. It was, after all, hard to take health advice from gentlemen who still treated leeches as first responders. One particularly vivid illustration published in The Lancet showed a diagram comparing a normal female torso to that of a corset wearer. The latter resembled an hourglass that had suffered a nervous breakdown. The stomach had been nudged into the chest cavity, the lungs compressed like concertinas, and the heart looked genuinely confused about its postcode. Still, many women clung firmly and tightly to their corsets, insisting, often while fainting delicately, that they were perfectly comfortable. As comfortable, perhaps, as a decorative birdcage strapped around one's midsection could be. Some even claimed that tight lacing gave them a sort of euphoric clarity, which, candidly, could have been oxygen deprivation. Enter Dr. Ludovicus Versfeld, a Dutch physician visiting London, who wrote a treatise partly inspired by observing a woman sneeze and immediately collapse due to the sudden pressure exerted by her own undergarments. His pamphlet, On the Perils of Pulmonary Restriction in the Modern Lady, delicately suggested that breathing might be helpful for vitality and long-term survival. But health was never the only agenda. The corset had become symbolic. It was virtue stitched in whalebone. To be tightly laced was not merely to follow fashion. It was to demonstrate moral discipline, social aspiration, and an admirable ability to not complain, even while possibly dislodging one's spleen. Victorian etiquette manuals even taught women how to respond gracefully to being unable to walk upstairs without dizziness. One suggests, sweetly, that a lady may pause mid-ascent and admire the banister, which was code, one suspects, for resist falling dramatically. Still, in whispered chambers of the Royal College of Physicians, there was concern. Autopsies of women who had worn corsets daily for decades began showing telltale signs: compressed rib cages, twisted spines, hearts moved slightly askew, as though nudged lovingly by fashion's unforgiving hand. Yet corsetry persisted, because after all, the waif-like silhouette was not just endorsed by elite opinion, it was manufactured by it. Fashion journals lauded absurdly narrow waists with poetic fervor. Her waist could be spanned by a gentleman's hands, one columnist cooed, apparently assuming that gentlemen walked around with unusually large measuring capabilities and small regard for basic human biology. Physicians marched on, publishing new condemnations with stiff upper lips and increasingly elaborate anatomical engravings. They warned that corsets made pregnancy dangerous, walking difficult, and digestion an elaborate pursuit requiring both patience and fewer sandwiches. And yet, lace continued winning over lungs. As the candlelight of the 1860s shimmered across dinner tables and drawing rooms, the silhouette remained supreme. Against the backdrop of velvet drapes and gaslit mirrors, the corset clung on, not just as a garment, but as a complicated armor of beauty, self-discipline, and societal approval. Somewhere, in a polite clinic not far from Piccadilly, a weary doctor adjusted his spectacles and sighed, thumbing through yet another letter from a most breathless patient who had recently begun experiencing a gentle internal crumpling. "Stop wearing the corset," he penned back, the ink flowing as slowly as progress. But the letter would likely arrive just in time for tea, and be read while standing very straight, shoulders back, lungs despairing, dreams tightly laced but ever so fashionable. And so, as physicians sharpened their quills for another round of anatomical complaints, a new chapter in the corseted tale was about to be spun, just around the next tightly cinched corner. Imagine, if you will, a genteel drawing room in mid-19th century Bath. Plush chaise lounges beneath gaslight chandeliers, the tick of a grandfather clock keeping time with the rhythmic sound of distant hooves rapping down cobbled streets. And seated neatly atop one of those chairs, anxiously sipping lemon water in gloves far too tight, is Miss Georgiana Tittlewack, age 25, spine like a wrought iron fence, lungs resembling two overstuffed cravats, and a fashionable waistline that could disappear behind a well-fed cucumber. Doctors had noticed something odd by now. Women were fainting rather a lot. One of the earliest medical treatises to raise a gloved eyebrow at the state of the female torso was penned in 1829 by Dr. William Buchan. He warned that corseting produces a constrained and unnatural figure. Now, to be fair, Buchan also believed in the curative effects of open windows and mild strolls. But his early murmurs laid groundwork for what would become a full-fledged Victorian medical concern, the corset catastrophe. By the 1850s, the warnings became more detailed and more alarmed. Doctors began declaring that livers were being jostled like jelly on a galloping cart, ribs allegedly folded like umbrellas. Entire digestive systems were rumored to fall into peculiar arrangements that no anatomy chart could comfortably explain. Autopsies were cited where ribs curved inwards, like monstrous claws. Some said the heart was squished northward, forced to beat under one's collarbone, like a tenant living in the attic. Now, let us pause a moment here. These doctors weren't entirely wrong. X-rays, which would eventually help confirm much of the internal squashage, hadn't been invented yet. But even without modern imaging, physicians knew the body wasn't intended to resemble a wasp. And yet, if a woman were to leave the house without her corset, it might have been considered only slightly more scandalous than leaving without one's skirt. To diagnose the corset-induced ailments, Victorian doctors used a variety of tools, among them the highly fallible yet deeply confident method of wrist measuring, judging a woman's supposed natural waist by comparing its size to that of her wrist. If you were wondering whether this had any basis in anatomical science, the answer lies somewhere between no and absolutely not. Still, ailments attributed to tight lacing abounded. Ladies reported fainting spells after ascending as few as 3 stairs, shortness of breath while they reading emotionally exciting novels, heart palpitations possibly caused by either the corset or the scandalous Mr. Darcy. Cases of hysteria continued to baffle male doctors, many of whom never stopped to think that a woman might be distressed by the fact that her liver had migrated beneath her shoulder blade. Then there was the infamous medical illustration known simply as the corseted skeleton. It portrayed the bones of the female form as distorted inward, their ribs curved with a sense of pure indignation, like an irritated fence. Whether entirely accurate or a well-meaning bit of medical propaganda, the image spread through medical journals and society pages alike. It gave physicians something credible to point at and say, with Victorian gravitas, "See, your spleen should not resemble a squashed turnip." But most women, upon hearing such medical warnings, responded politely and then headed straight home to tighten the drawstrings. Doctors also offered some rather creative alternatives to the worrisome corset. Chief among them, the health corset, which attempted to shift pressure from the waist to the hips and underbust. It sounded promising on paper, but in practice, it resembled a leather barrel with opinions. Predictably, it was not a bestseller. And so the war between fashion and medicine quietly raged on. Sketches appeared in periodicals. One memorable cartoon showed a lady being corded like a roast with squawking geese, protesting in the background. Still, many women chose the corset. After all, societal expectations are often louder than doctors, particularly if the doctors have alarming beards and names like Horace Bumbletrout, MD. As the night deepens and the gas lamps flicker low, our story drifts gently onward. For while some voices were beginning to speak louder against the corset, a new invention, a rebel in cotton and freedom, was about to stir things up entirely. As the dust of the drawing room settled and the CE gas lamps flickered to life, Victorian ladies prepared for battle, though the enemy was not invading forces or rebellious footmen, but rather dinner parties. And the weapon of choice, the corset, of course, lauded for its ability to sculpt the female form into the coveted S-curve silhouette. It was the unsung hero of social supremacy and simultaneously the arch nemesis of everyone's internal organs. Doctors, particularly the gentlemen who were both medically trained and appallingly underpaid, began to issue warnings. "Madam," they'd say, adjusting their pince-nez, "you are reshaping your liver like it's a cushion you've sat on too aggressively." These proclamations were met with delicate laughter, a flutter of lace handkerchiefs, and often a polite request to fetch more salts and smelling bottles, because the lady in question had just fainted. It was around this time that medical illustrations became rather dramatic. Suddenly there were detailed cross-sections of women's torsos squeezed like improperly packed picnic baskets. Artists enjoyed showing organs being squished up into the chest cavity or drifting melancholically into the pelvis, like they were searching for new real estate. And honestly, while the medical community tried to raise alarms, these images often looked more like Victorian horrorcore art than persuasive health campaigns. There was, perhaps, a small misunderstanding in terminology. While one might warn of organ displacement, fashionable society heard something closer to organ reorganization, and that, to their minds, sounded a bit more elegant. One does want one's spleen in a more socially acceptable position, doesn't one? Of course, Victorian physicians attempted a bit more sober communication. Dr. William White, a London practitioner with a spectacular beard and aggressive handwriting, wrote in 1874 that corsets inhibited natural respiration and peristaltic motion. For those unfamiliar with highfalutin phrasing, that roughly translates to, "You can't breathe or digest pudding," which, come to think of it, were both rather unfortunate outcomes for a night out. Nonetheless, the public, especially the well-to-do set, remained unconvinced. Letters to the editor of ladies' magazines often proudly declared things like, "I have worn a corset continuously for 27 years, and I am only mildly dizzy at all times." It was, for some, a badge of honor, a very tight, difficult-to-fasten badge, but a badge nonetheless. Enter the hygienic corset movement. Yes, believe it or not, the Victorians tried to make corsets healthy. Some models were designed with additional straps and levers, like steampunk parachute harnesses, intending to support rather than squeeze. Others incorporated netting or even, gasp, elastic. But alas, these were considered drab, unfashionable, and occasionally squeaky. There's nothing quite like hearing a medical-grade corset emit a mournful creak during a quadrille to ruin your evening. One might imagine that women would simply remove their corsets altogether, and some did, though only briefly, and only when no one was watching, including husbands. Stories abound of newlywed grooms on wedding nights discovering that the enticingly wasted goddess they'd just wed had, upon removing her corset, transformed into an entirely different and quite possibly able to breathe woman. These gentle betrayals were referred to in hushed tones as crinolinal shock. Meanwhile, in the quieter corners of the countryside, some physicians took to giving public lectures, complete with lantern slides and occasional moral panic. They declared that tightlacing was likely to cause not only physical ailments, but also emotional ones, hysteria, melancholy, and a predisposition toward writing poetry in gazebos, which, all things considered, does not sound any worse than the average Tuesday. The advice from doctors almost always concluded in the same way, with an exasperated remark and, occasionally, a suggestion to try more rational dress. But rational dress, while medically sound, tragically lacked embroidery. Ironically, the most potent warning may have come not from physicians but from pianists, for it was they who, due to frequent musical punctuations at gatherings, observed a worrying trend. Ladies who played with such tight-laced torsos that, mid-sonata, they'd simply tip sideways onto the pianoforte. The sedentary collapse of corseted composers was such a frequent affair that fainting couches began migrating closer to the music room. Still, society twirled onward, tightly wound and politely breathless. As each ribbon was tugged and each hook secured, one could hear the faint sigh of a lung, the groan of a stomach, and the soft, almost imperceptible chuckle of a doctor muttering to himself, "She'll be back next week with a stomach like a concertina." And now, as the parlors dim and the evening tea cools in its porcelain cup, we drift gently toward whispers of resistance and women who would soon say, ever so softly yet firmly, "No more stays," as twilight dimmed the oil lamps of Victorian drawing rooms and tea cooled in delicate porcelain cups. A silent war unfolded beneath layers of petticoats. It was not a war of rifles or sabers, but of breath. The simple act of inhaling, yes, dear listener, filling one's lungs, had become a quiet rebellion. To understand the battleground, we must descend into the parlor, the ballroom, the bustling walkways of late 19th century London, where the corset was not merely a garment, but a declaration. It declared class, femininity, posture, and unfortunately, a certain disregard for the real estate needs of internal organs. Victorian doctors, increasingly perturbed by what they termed corset maladies, began scribbling furiously into their leather-bound notebooks. Dr. William Strange, yes, quite literally, wrote papers on the dangers of tight-lacing, a term which still sounds faintly scandalous. These health professionals reported an alarming variety of ailments, ranging from deformed ribs to the ever-delicate-sounding hysterical suffocations. Imagine poor Mrs. Beadle taking a dainty stroll through Hyde Park when she suddenly faints face first into a hedge. Was it the heat? The scandal of visible ankle? Nay, it was her lungs, compressed into the size of a bumblebee's teacup. Doctors began holding lectures that read like Gothic novels. Tales of spleens migrating, stomachs revolting, and livers displaced like unwanted furniture. In some medical illustrations, the internal arrangement of a tightly corseted woman resembled a game of anatomical Jenga on the brink, but facts alone could not loosen stays. No, what was needed was a polite yet firm coup of the corset. Enter, stage left, Lady Florence Nightingale. Yes, the famed lamp-carrying nurse from the Crimean War. She, too, issued gentle tirades against the corset. Though she never publicly burned any undergarments, that would come later, she did refer to fashion-induced illness as one of the more preventable evils. It wasn't just the squeezing that worried physicians, It was the timing. You see, girls were often placed in corsets long before they could properly spell peritoneum. Child-sized corsets were marketed as training devices, which is the kindest way to describe what was essentially an early 19th century rib vise. One Dr. Benjamin Ward Richardson went so far as to present a brass model of the human ribcage, compressed to corseted dimensions, to a room full of shocked gentlemen at a medical symposium. He then reportedly announced, "This is not art. This is tragedy in lace." The audience gasped. Some clutched their monocles. A few women in the gallery promptly fainted, though no one could confirm whether it was from outrage or the effects of their own corsets. And let us not forget the curious case of tight-lacing competitions. In certain elite circles, ladies boasted reductions in waist size, as though they were sharing investment tips. "I've gone from 18 inches to 16, one young debutante might whisper. "Next season, I shan't turn a corner without assistance." Here, in this tightly wound world, breath became both luxury and rebellion. Folding fans were not just fashionable, they were essential tools of ventilation. Opera houses discreetly placed chairs near doors where women could recover from an aria, or, more likely, from their own spleen sounding an internal distress flare. But irony, ever the patient historian, watched it all unfold. For even as doctors lined their shelves with x-rays of compressed ribs and detailed accounts of fainting fits in haberdasheries, fashion magazines kept printing illustrations of wasp-waisted silhouettes. Women, caught between health and high tea, simply continued holding their breath, quite literally in many cases. Still, medical science was not without its quiet victories. Whispers of rational dress began circulating in more forward-thinking drawing rooms. Some women began loosening their laces behind closed doors, not out of scandal, but sanity. Each button unhooked was a sigh of relief, a tiny revolution of the torso. And so, gentle listener, as the gaslights flicker over mahogany mantels and the brass bedposts cool beneath embroidered linen, we settle into this world of cautious progress, a place where the corset still reigns, if less tightly, and where every breath taken is ever so slightly freer than the last. Let us drift now into hushed corridors and velvet shadows, where fashion begins to flirt with reform, and where the whispers of a new silhouette are rustling ever so softly in the drapes. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1878, a small group of medical men gathered in London's Athenaeum Club, where cigars, skepticism, and a mutual disdain for fashion held equal weight. These were Victorian doctors, earnest, mustachioed, and prone to authoring pamphlets with alarming titles like "The Rib-Crushing Lunacy of Lady Fashions." They had officially had enough. For decades, women had been cinching themselves ever tighter into corsets, often to the astonishment of their internal organs and the despair of their respiratory systems. The ideal waist was ever shrinking, from a health-conscious 24 inches down toward a gasp-inducing 18. One woman, it was said, managed 13, though critics wondered if she ever sat down again. While fashionistas praised this architectural marvel of whalebone and silk ribbons, physicians were beginning to treat women for everything from shortness of breath to palpitations of a most inconvenient nature, both of which just so happened to coincide with corseted tea parties and breathless promenades in Hyde Park. Dr. Jedediah Mumps, whose name betrayed a rather doomed attempt at gravitas, was particularly vocal. He described the corset as a vice not only of the flesh, but against it, which sounded vaguely theological, until you realized he literally meant the corset was squashing vital organs like an overzealous book press. In heated lectures, he drew chalk diagrams of displaced spleens and sagging diaphragms, which had the unfortunate side effect of causing several faintings amongst his own students. To be fair, not all faintings were corset-related. Some were merely due to the extreme boredom brought on by Victorian public lectures, where one could be asleep by the third sentence and buried by the fifth. Still, the evidence was mounting. Autopsies began revealing peculiar anatomical mischief: stomachs creeping upwards, livers unnaturally folded, ribs contorted into tragic figure eights. One medical journal soberly documented the case of a woman whose corset had migrated a rib directly into the territory of her spleen, prompting one reader to comment, rather drolly, that at least her organs were making friends. Doctors warned that corsets could cause prolapses, fainting spells, disrupted digestion, and even uterine rebellion. Human anatomy, it seemed, rather preferred mobility over mummification. Of course, not everyone agreed. A chorus of corset defenders, mostly fashion houses and certain gentlemen who'd never worn one, dismissed these allegations as badly stitched, arguing that women had been lacing tightly for centuries and were, by and large, still alive. One satirical newspaper printed a cartoon of a delicate ribcage holding up a placard that read, "I quite like the support, actually." Lady Prudence Featherbottom, a socialite known for her impossibly tiny waist and her even smaller tolerance for criticism, famously quipped, "Ignorance may be bliss for the lungs, but it is no dressmaker." She routinely hosted soirees where guests were expected to tightlace before arrival, and any woman caught breathing too freely might find herself sent home for indecency. But not all was silk and satire. Within the folds of the debate emerged a quieter revolution. Women's health advocates, still a rather underground species in the 1870s, began raising eyebrows and, on brave days, their voices. They argued that beauty shouldn't come with bruised intestines, and that perhaps the human waist had been miscast as a villain in need of constant correction. Slowly, the whispers of reform grew louder. The Rational Dress Society was founded in 1881, and though its name promised very little excitement, its members campaigned fiercely for clothing that allowed for walking, breathing, and the occasional laugh without risking internal rearrangement. Still, the corset, like a determined houseguest, lingered. Even among those who agreed it might be doing damage, women often continued to lace. For some, it was tradition. For others, it was social entrapment delicately disguised as silk. And for many, well, it was just what one did. You wore a corset the way one might wear etiquette, tightly and without question. But in back corners of parlors and under lamplight behind drawn curtains, women began to swap whispered tales, not of scandal, but of liberation. A dress with no boning, a bodice with room for a full breath. Rumors of a garment called the health corset, which sounded rather like an edible doorknob but promised to disturb the liver no more than a mild tea. As dusk settled over the smog street rooftops of London, a soft revolution draped itself in calico and cotton whispers. Reform had barely begun, and the corset still gripped the everyday silhouette by the ribs. But the doctor's warnings echoed quietly, like a heartbeat trapped behind satin laces. Somewhere, a button popped off in protest, and in the pages of a long-forgotten anatomy lecture, the next act of this peculiar fashion rebellion was already being etched. Ironically enough, nearly all of the dire warnings Victorian doctors gave about corsets seemed to land with the thudding finality of a teacup being set, politely yet firmly, upon a saucer. That is to say, politely delivered, barely noticed, and almost immediately ignored. By the middle of the 19th century, corsets had evolved from simple garments of structure and support into architectural marvels of bodily compression, sculpting women into improbable hourglasses with waists measuring little more than the circumference of a plum pudding. It was around this time that medical men, brandishing impressive moustaches and Latin phrases, began issuing grave proclamations. Too tight lacing, they warned, was wreaking quiet havoc upon the nation's internal organs. This may sound dramatic, and it absolutely was, and yet not entirely fictitious. One particularly devoted physician, Dr. William Henry Flower, a man as concerned about rib cages as he was about dignity, plopped a pair of corset-warped skeletons into the anatomical exhibit at the Royal College of Surgeons. There they stood, or rather leaned under glass, eerie, cinched, and permanently arched as though mid-sigh. While visiting Londoners murmured things like, "Good heavens," and "more tea," Dr. Flower offered solemn lectures in which he used phrases such as permanent displacement of the liver. Unfortunately, Outside those exhibits, the liver remained largely displaced and society largely unbothered. Women, it turned out, were not easily frightened. Not by liver displacement, not by hypermobility of the spine, and certainly not by tales of fainting spells, when fainting in Victorian society was so closely tied to elegance. In fact, swooning in corsets had taken on an air of ladylike refinement, like carrying a lace handkerchief or fainting discreetly into a chaise longue. Doctors, in response, began drawing alarming diagrams in medical journals which only other doctors would read. One such diagram showed the heart, once blissfully upright, now scowling and squished into a posture of lifelong discontent, all courtesy of restrictive midriffs. Another favorite image was the one in which the stomach had seemingly given up, folded itself in half like a letter, and moved slightly to the left to avoid confrontation. Yet for all their passion, even the most high-strung medical experts were no match for the fashion publications of the day. The Ladies' Cabinet of Fashion, for instance, once printed a corset pattern accompanied by this poetic prophecy: "To lace, perchance, is to live more finely." And really, who can argue with rhymed encouragement? Still, there were outliers. Dr. John Lizzers, sharp of tongue and brimming with righteous concern, published an entire volume in 1859 titled "The Use and Abuse of the Figure in Relation to Health," a title no Victorian woman likely read, though one must admire the effort. In it, he thundered about the physical shattering caused by corsetry, claiming that tightlacing was responsible for maladies ranging from migraines to melancholy to perversions of the moral sense. It remains unclear what those last ones entailed, though it does suggest he was either very worried or very confused. Meanwhile, over in the ever-dramatic corners of Victorian newspapers, society was treated to increasingly breathless testimonies, letters from anonymous women signed only "a misguided waist" or "formerly 19 inches." These confessions told of cracked ribs, sighing stomachs, and surprise engagements broken off due to tight lace-induced indigestion. Yet even these accounts had a strangely glamorous sheen, as though suffering fashionably was part of every young lady's education, right after embroidery and the proper way to faint upon hearing news of a cousin's elopement. Interestingly, not all medical opinions were entirely against the corset. Some doctors, perhaps swayed by their wives or an adroit milliner, argued that mild corsetry could assist posture, discourage slouching, and serve as an excellent deterrent to overeating at supper parties. These were not the leading thinkers of the day, but they were uncannily popular at garden soirees. As the century tiptoed onward, the debates grew louder, the corsets grew tighter, and the waists, they grew smaller still. In some cases, measuring just 16 inches around. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the diameter of a generous fruitcake or a well-fed cat. And yet the women persisted, with poise, with pluck, and with a remarkable talent for stitching elegance from discomfort. Medicine had issued its warnings, skeletons had made public appearances, organs had issued muffled cries for help, but fashion, ever the charming tyrant, held court still. And somewhere, in a small London parlour, scented faintly with lavender and laudanum, a young lady tightened her laces before calling for her afternoon tea. One more inch, she thought. Just one. So naturally, in our next midnight meander, we drift gently into the curious world of corsetry's defenders, those unexpected voices who, with a straight face and a fiercely upright spine, insisted the corset was nature's ally, with just a touch more boning. As the soft fog of the 1880s rolled over London's cobbled streets, layering soot and mystery in equal measure, the debate in medical circles was reaching a tight-laced crescendo. Corsetry, long the emblem of respectable womanhood and occasional fainting, was now becoming the darling enemy of physicians wielding scalpels and Latin phrases with equal flair. Letters poured into journals like The Lancet, bearing titles such as "On the Displacement of Spleens in Ladylike Persons," or the perennial favourite, "Notes on the Ribcage of a Genteel Invalid." One particularly flamboyant surgeon, Dr. Erasmus Tickleworth, whose name alone demanded trust, declared publicly that corsets had caused more, a rearranged anatomy than the Trojan War. A bold claim, considering the Trojan War had 10 years, wooden horses, and Helen. But Dr. Tickleworth, like many of his era, was undeterred by proportions. He had diagrams. So many diagrams. Wobbly cross-sections of female torsos where livers slumped sadly beside kneecaps and hearts were shown drifting into left armpits. The average Victorian medical illustration looks more like a surrealist map of Narnia than the actual human body. But no matter. Earnestness made up for anatomical accuracy. And it wasn't only male doctors pointing fingers at the corset. Female physicians, few but formidable, stepped in with their own critiques. Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, notable for being both Britain's first licensed female physician and someone possessed of remarkable composure, once warned that tightlacing would unhouse the very organs we rely upon for composure and digestion. Digestive doom was a recurring theme. Corsets, they claimed, squeezed the stomach into a state of polite submission, often resulting in nausea, breathlessness, and a kind of Victorian heartburn that made industrial-strength peppermint the era's most romantic after-dinner mint. Indeed, advertisements for medicinal tonics began to flourish. Bottles promising relief from corset cramps or a gentle repositioning elixir for wayward kidneys lined apothecary cabinets and mystery drawers alike. Perhaps no alarm was sounded so dramatically as the case of Miss Dorabella Finch, whose fainting episode at a Surrey garden party became the talk of the civil parish. She had collapsed beside a rose trellis, clutching her parasol like a fallen fencing champion. A passing doctor, jogging rather scandalously, attempted resuscitation with smelling salts, only to diagnose her with compression of female jubilation, an affliction he believed directly linked to restricted diaphragmatic movement. The local paper refrained from publishing the exact term, but promised that she was on the mend with a flannel undergarment and twice daily morphine toddies. And yet, amid all this hoopla, there were defenders of the corset too. Counter-medical voices, mostly fashion journals and upholstery enthusiasts, insisted the human spleen was entirely mobile and likely in want of a squeeze. One particularly belligerent fashion editor wrote, "All significant organs shift in response to gravity, emotions, or a disappointing season's waistlines. Why should the corset shoulder all blame?" Indeed, the phrase "wandering wombs" was still hauntingly present in some circles, harkening back to ancient Greek ideas that mistook uterine independence for a kind of petulant ghost within. Still, the evidence, even through its fog of florid prose and dubious sketches, did mount. Autopsy reports filed by forward-thinking, or backward-looking, pathologists noted ribs bent like soft licorice, stomachs shaped suspiciously like accordions, and spines resembling hopeless question marks. Whether all these deformities were due solely to corsets or merely to Victorians sitting oddly while writing long letters, the conclusion was beautifully inevitable. The human torso, apparently, did not appreciate being treated like a rolled-up carpet. As the medical community issued stern warnings and prescribed milder stays, less wail, more wishful thinking, the public response remained oddly split. Wealthy society women, reluctant to give up sartorial scaffolding, often wore their corsets while consulting their doctors, nodding solemnly as they were warned against wearing them. Old habits, it seemed, died harder than underwire. Still, a breeze of reform was in the air, a gentle shifting, like loosened laces. Dress reformers, backed by science and perhaps a little indigestion, began suggesting alternate garment options. Sweater-like blouses and high-waisted, loose-fitting gowns snuck onto the pages of women's magazines, dubbed with revolutionary nicknames like air corsets and rational wear. It didn't catch on immediately, of course. Rationality rarely does. But a seed had been planted, in soil slightly less compressed than before. And so, even as corsets clung stubbornly to the silhouettes of the sensible and stylish, the foundations were beginning to shift. Not just under dresses, but quietly, under society itself. In the dusk light parlors, lit by gas lamp flicker, where nervous daughters sat ramrod straight in embroidered chaise lounges, a question began to rise softly, like the intake of a never-slouched breath. What might a body do if left to its own curious shape? A question we'll cradle more gently next time as we follow the trail of whalebone into the curious world of corset advertisements, where dreams were cinched, lungs politely ignored, and the human form was sold like a moral necessity. By the 1880s, Victorian women had started hearing little whispers, some from the mouths of doctors, others from the suspiciously flared nostrils of their own lungs, that perhaps corsets weren't the magical exoskeletons of virtue they were said to be. Physicians, who had spent decades largely ignoring the social implications of women slowly folding themselves in half like human envelopes, began publishing the medical equivalents of hem. These reports invariably came with titles like "On the Dangers of Prolonged Constriction of the Thoraco-Abdominal Region in the Female Form, *, which is science speak for "You are crushing your ribs, madam." Let's take a moment to consider the bones involved. The human rib cage is not, as one might innocently hope, fond of pretend shape-shifting. Yet, thanks to the ever-tightening embrace of whalebone and steel, many Victorian women developed a condition delicately known as corset waist, as if the skeleton had politely volunteered to develop a waspish silhouette out of sheer aesthetic loyalty. Bustling medical journals reported that lower ribs were not just compressed, they were coaxed into unnatural angles, as though ribs, like etiquette, were something that could be rearranged with determination. Post-mortem examinations showed curved spines, displaced livers, lungs resembling lopsided pastry shells, and stomachs hanging on for dear life somewhere near the knees. Despite these anatomical melodramas, fashion magazines continued to insist that a proper silhouette required a waist measurement somewhere between impossibly small and may cause fainting when startled. Now you'd think the swelling list of ailments — indigestion, hysteria, chronic coughing, breathlessness, spinal curvature, even uterine prolapse — might have sparked revolution. But no, just more delicate embroidery on the front panel and maybe a padlock on the back clasp for added commitment. Hysteria, after all, could be every inch as fashionable as lace if paired with the right seal parasol. There were, of course, doctors who sounded the medical alarm with a tone just shy of clanging. One doctor, William Henry Flower, a name that sounds like he prescribed daffodils, famously exhibited a pair of corset-distorted ribs at the Royal College of Surgeons. He didn't say, "Behold this ghastly evidence," exactly, but that was the general vibe. Audiences stared at the bony contortions, probably half aghast and half intrigued, imagining which duchess had managed to twist her thorax into the shape of a sideways violin scroll. It wasn't just the ribs. Nerves were compressed, digestion was practically a high-risk sport, and women themselves were gently informed by professionals that their wombs might indeed attempt escape someday, presumably packing a small bonnet and lace gloves on the way out. Still, corsets held their ground, or more precisely, held women off the ground, suspended halfway to fainting most days. Society, with its unrelenting passion for aesthetic, suffering, insisted that a woman's outer appearance was a direct reflection of her inner moral fiber, and that moral fiber could, evidently, be best displayed by fashioning one's liver into a decorative brooch beneath 12 yards of embroidered silk. Even when health critiques made headlines, they were often brushed off as the whimsical pontifications of overwrought scientists overly fond of diagrams. Some women would nod politely at these statistics, and then ask their maid to tighten the corset just a smidge more for supper. And so corset reform societies emerged, sipping weak tea and nervously adjusting their moderately looser bodices. Their mission: to educate women about the hazards of organ origami and promote rational dress, a phrase met with the sort of social horror typically reserved for public flatulence. Rational dress suggested that women could walk briskly, breathe deeply, and commit the unforgivable sin of appearing practical. The satirical magazines, naturally, had a field day. Cartoons sprang up featuring women with waists narrower than their necks, trying to play tennis and collapsing like badly assembled puppets. One particularly grim piece, titled "The Martyrs of Fashion," illustrated skeletons in silk gowns, eternally clutched by corsets from beyond the grave, as if the next life also required a fashionable figure. And yet, through all this, through the doctors and diagrams, the collapsing Victorian women and their stubborn devotion to the deadly hourglass, progress began its slow, corset unlacing march. But before any real change could rattle the stays of society, another figure, decidedly less skeletal, would stride into the picture with bold ideas about mobility, modernity, and bicycle-friendly bodices. As the evening gaslight flickers low and carriages rattle distantly along mist-blurred cobbles, we find ourselves at a most peculiar junction in Victorian medical advice. The Corset Rebellion of 1875, led, absurdly and rather unintentionally, by a group of nearly anonymous Belgian steam train passengers. Yes, the story begins not in London, but in the overheated first-class carriage of the Ostend Express, wherein a particularly tightly laced British matron, Mrs. Honoria Pritchard Bletherington, fainted clean across an unfortunate customs officer's paperwork. The cause? Heat, pressure, and approximately 17 silk petticoats. The effect? International headlines. Well, small columns in eccentric health journals, which in Victorian England was nearly the same thing. This tempest in a brougham coincided with what some called a medical enlightenment, and others called a great deal of fuss over female ribs. You see, several doctors, bearded men named things like Aloysius Threadwell or Dr. Septimus Blodge, had begun publishing earnest papers in grim lithographed journals, complete with faint anatomical diagrams and phrases like compression of the thoracic cavity may result in moral laxity. Now, why would squashed lungs make women morally suspect? That, dear sleeper, was one of the enduring mysteries of Victorian logic, alongside their passionate fear of sudden drafts and the belief that trousers revealing an ankle might cause uncontrollable swooning in clergymen. But back to the corsets. Dr. Blodge, bless his pipe-chomping sincerity, toured village halls across northern England, delivering what he called sermons of the sternum. These featured dramatic demonstrations using stiffened cravats, pig ribs, and once, a long-suffering taxidermied otter. He'd bang on about organs being displaced like billiard balls down a staircase, and illustrated all with something he called the Chart of Female Lagoons, which many thought was a map of Scotland turned sideways. Meanwhile, Queen Victoria, who wore corsets but never spoke about them, simply ignored all the fuss. This caused the nation to wobble uncertainly between concern and compliance, which is the British way after all. In more fashionable circles, things began to get wobbly. Actresses began quietly defying the boning. Sarah Bernhardt, the French stage enchantress, reportedly wore not a corset, but a silk dressing gown cinched with stubborn indifference. When asked by an English couturier if she feared being uncontained, she is said to have regarded him coolly and replied, "I am already spectacular. I contain multitudes." Not to be outdone, several English poets joined the protest. A minor romantic named Crispin Moonweevil penned a sonnet titled "To the Compressed Lady in Pewter Grey." It began, "She sighed so deep, her bodice snapped, and set my cravat quite a jap." It was not well reviewed. Still, the movement gathered cautious steam. Dr. Threadwell published a handbook called The Rational Torso, which, while largely unreadable, did cause the British Library to move all anatomy books from the unseemly shelf toward the scientific and slightly awkward section. And yet, even with steam, poetry, and fainting in trains, the corset held its ground. Quite literally, it was laced, hooked, reinforced, and back again. For every well-meaning doctor with a diagram, there were 10 fashion plates advising ever tinier waists, held beside society columns praising the waspish elegance of women who could not breathe above a whisper. Indeed, a lady might declare, while being shoelaced into a heavily boned silk hourglass, "I should very much like to breathe full measure during Lent." To which her maid would mutter, "Perhaps Whitsun, miss." Even corset reformers had trouble holding the line, especially when the new, supposedly healthy models resembled tense fabric suspensions only wearable during early spring or while resting very, very still. So the corset stayed. Its grip softened through the decades, but in 1875, it still governed female silhouettes more firmly than Parliament governed anything. And those well-meaning doctors, they soldiered on, waving their pamphlets, giving melancholic talks to audiences of 3 and a badger. Yet they planted something, an idea that a woman might perhaps dress as though her lungs mattered. But that revolution would take another generation, or 3. Now, as candlelight flutters against embroidered wallpaper, and somewhere a parlor clock softly ticks, let us loosen the figurative stays of thought and slip quietly into the dreaming hush of what comes next. A tale not of constriction, but of invention. As the velvet dusk of the 1880s settled over Britain's soot-dusted rooftops, a curious tension stirred in drawing rooms and apothecaries alike. It was the golden hour of moral disapproval, and no one was quite as industrious or as poetically alarmed as the Victorian medical establishment. For reasons perhaps equal parts scientific and vaguely offended, these gentlemen of medicine had turned their unsmiling attention to the corset. Yes, the corset, that lace-trimmed ribcage hugger and symbol of polite society's tightly compressed aesthetics. At a glance, it was a garment. At length, according to Victorian doctors, it was a full-blown existential threat. Now, it's important to understand the tools these doctors had at the time. They lacked MREs, CT scanners, or even a reliable way to tell you your appendix wasn't just throwing a tantrum. But what they did have was fervent imagination, a chalkboard, and access to alarming cadavers. In perhaps the world's earliest attempt at social commentary through post-mortem forensics, doctors began dissecting women who had worn corsets for most of their lives. What did they find? Displaced livers, crooked spines, ribs suspiciously trying to become acquainted with hips. These anatomical surprises were met with gasps and newspaper editorials, usually titled something like "The Corset, Instrument of Civilization or Organ Torture Vice." It depended on how high their monocles sat that afternoon. Enter Dr. William Henry Flower, one of the more vocal corset critics and director of the Natural History Museum, because nothing screams obstetrics expertise like some light fossil work. Dr. Flower once gave an earnest lecture comparing female torsos to squashed bottles and geologically misshapen formations, illustrated with diagrams naturally. It's hard to say how many women were influenced by Flower's visceral depictions, but many men in the audience reportedly crossed their legs uncomfortably out of pure sympathetic compression. Doctors of the day warned that corsets caused hysteria, which Victorians believed was a woman's default setting when exposed to reading, opinions, or strong breezes. Corsets, they argued, only accelerated the problem, jostling the poor woman's uterus into road rage. A tight-laced lady might find herself breathless, not from romance, but from her lungs throwing up surrender flags and plagued by swooning, indigestion, and an inability to perform mathematical operations. One panicked physician even posited that corsets could cause mild insanity. This was, to be fair, a time when nearly everything was accused of causing mild insanity. Books, bicycles, and looking at Venus through a telescope also made the list. Doctors began holding public lectures and publishing tracts with all the urgency of a society trying to save its women from an invisible hug. Some even built wooden torsos to demonstrate what internal organs looked like after years of eager lacing. These displays were sometimes showcased next to cautionary pamphlets featuring hand-drawn cross-sections of women reorganized like overstuffed suitcases. While modern science might raise an eyebrow, Victorians raised a gloved handkerchief to their lips and quietly gasped. Meanwhile, women, like all functioning humans, had their own opinions. Some embraced the warnings, casting off their corsets with the cautious glee of someone unbuckling a too-tight holiday belt. Others scoffed, noting that a man's liver was also sometimes found misplaced, often blamable to gin rather than undergarments. And some women simply swapped whalebone boning for more rational corsets, following the advice of doctors with one hand and fashion magazines with the other. Still, the medical panic about corsetry persisted like a fog over an English moor. The more impassioned the warnings, the tighter society seemed to lace its expectations. After all, beauty had its rules, and unfortunately, many of those rules required internal rearrangement. As time went on, critics and corset makers both indulged in a kind of competitive alarm, one warning sternly of crushed kidneys, and the other countering with a new, breathable fabric, allegedly approved by cheerful Parisian physicians. The truth likely lay, as it often does, somewhere inconveniently in the middle, hiding between the second and third rib. Outside these bustling debates, fog rolled through cobbled streets, casting soft shadows against the lantern glow of evening. In quiet homes, women unfastened the day's seams, sighing in the gentle undoing of fashion's embrace. The dangers might have worn lace, but so did the comforts. And somewhere, a doctor scribbled furiously by candlelight, drafting his next pamphlet titled, "Why You Shouldn't Sit Too Long Either." And so, as society continued its gentle tug-of-war between health and the hourglass dream, a new whisper began to drift through parlors and dressmakers' shops, not of what corsets did to the body, but what society might be doing to itself. But that's a sigh for another evening, as the 1890s exhaled their final, lace-trimmed breath and the new century peeked around the corner like an inquisitive child clutching a toy zeppelin. Corset criticism reached a new level of frothy absurdity. For decades, doctors had warned women that corsets compressed their internal organs, fouled their lungs, stirred their wombs into a dizzy agitation, and prevented proper prayer posture. Very serious business indeed. But now, a new diagnosis emerged from the ruffled edge of medical thinking: corset-induced hysteria. Yes, that blanket term for everything from melancholy to mild sassiness was now being pinned to the bodice. Apparently, laced tightly enough, a woman's nervous system might unravel like a dropped spool of silk thread. One doctor, Robert T. Marley, who had genuinely no qualifications beyond a bushy moustache and misplaced confidence, once stated in a London medical journal that corsets could create unwholesome excitements of the spleen, as if the spleen were a wayward debutante on her second sherry. He argued passionately that the combination of restricted breathing, unnatural posture, and the internal steaming of passions caused by tight stays could incite fainting, delirium, and fevered imaginary romances, particularly those involving Frenchmen. His article, which was oddly specific and suspiciously steeped in personal heartbreak, prompted a robust wave of rebuttals from women's magazines, one of which was titled, "Sir, my spleen is fine, thank you." Meanwhile, designers, always keen to reinvent discomfort with flair, had begun promoting what they called the health corset. This enchanting paradox involved slightly less waist pinching and, brace yourself, a lower bust rise. The effect was to contain rather than contort, though women still needed a friend, a hook, and a prayer to get into it. Some even included special vents, a flirtation with ventilation that would have scandalized their ancestors in whalebone. Manufacturers promoted these corsets with the same enthusiasm usually reserved for miracle tonics. They promised everything from back support to spiritual enlightenment, and one advertisement claimed the garment aligned the spine and sensibilities, ushering in moral clarity and improved flirtation accuracy. For an extra fee, some corsets even came scented: lavender if you were timid, sandalwood if you were saucy. In a particularly ambitious American pamphlet, the maker of the ethereal embrace corset claimed a woman could ride a bicycle, raise a child, embroider a monogram, and recite Latin all while fully cinched. The illustrations depicted glowing women doing just that, although curiously, they were all slightly airborne, perhaps indicating either supernatural comfort or very poor accuracy in printing. Across the Atlantic, Victorian lady cyclists, yes, there were such magnificent creatures, were waging a quieter rebellion, refusing corsets in favor of looser blouses and divided skirts. These early feminists pedaled not just through parks, but also through the deeply entrenched fears of fainting, scandal, and visible ankles. Their bravery did not go unnoticed by the conservative press, which responded with headlines like "Wheels of Doom," "Women forsake the corset and possibly decency," and "Bloomers and Bedlam. Are we nearing the collapse of civilization?" Ironically, some physicians finally realized that encouraging women to loosen their corsets was working far better as advice when it came from fashion rather than from fretful men with hand-cranked electroshock devices in their offices. But there was still one corner of Victorian medicine that clung stubbornly to old ideas, the notion that corsets were the guardians of fertility. According to this camp, without the firm embrace of boning and silk, a woman's womb might wander off entirely, comically, and get lost somewhere around the elbow or knee. One doctor described a corset as a shepherd to the defenseless organs, raising the terrifying image of internal anatomy behaving like sheep. So the debate clattered on beneath gas lamps and over tea tables. Corsets as wicked vice or noble vessel, a health threat or an elegant necessity, a daily see-you prison or a subtle rebellion. And in a quiet townhouse in Kensington, an older widow named Harriet Granville was quietly converting her late husband's study into a corset-free salon. Over tea and Madeira cake, she welcomed women of like mind, botanists, poets, bicycle enthusiasts, who wished to breathe deeply while destroying Victorian decorum, one loosened lace at a time. Harriet called it the League for Respiratory Freedom. Their motto? Why, it was embroidered on a dainty linen pillow. Air is our birthright. And with that, the wind began to shift, ever so slightly, toward change. Just a sigh at first, a breeze fluttering through unbuttoned collars, and something firm beginning, ever so gently, to unlace. Let us drift toward what came next, where underpinnings met upstart modernity in an unexpected ballroom of reform, in the anxious heart of the 1890s, with Queen Victoria still managing to look both stately and slightly annoyed in every portrait. The fashion world was in full frocked frenzy. Corsets had reached what we can diplomatically call peak tightness, and the so-called wasp waist was not only endemic, but endorsed by magazines, advertisements, etiquette books, and, rather tragically, most mothers-in-law. While many Victorian gentlemen admired the hourglass silhouette as evidence of delicate femininity, doctors were having smaller, more oxygen-starved discussions in smoky rooms. Medical journals of the day were filled with cautious phrases like movement of internal organs and compression of the lower ribs, phrases that frankly lose much of their dramatic punch when compared to death by fashion, but were alarming nonetheless. One such gentleman, Dr. William Playfair for instance, not known for levity, grimly described the corset's impact as deforming the skeleton and impeding vital function. To which the fashion world essentially replied, "But such small waists, though." Victorian. Anatomy books began to fill up with curious illustrations, outlines of displaced livers, stomachs scraping politely against the spine, and rib cages that looked suspiciously like they were trying to sneak out the back exit. Many women came to clinics complaining of lightheadedness, breathlessness, and melancholia, though some doctors later admitted they couldn't always distinguish melancholia from garden variety disappointment in upper-class pudding. And yet, despite all this, corsets remained deeply woven, both literally and emotionally, into the fabric of Victorian identity. To be without one was to risk being classified as loose in more ways than one. Some brave souls, gawky and courageous, attempted to wear what they dubbed reform corsets, which were allegedly designed with comfort in mind. These often looked like what you'd get if a hammock and a harness had an awkward romantic encounter and decided to co-parent your torso. There were whispers of coarse, half-covered newspaper columns and raised eyebrow editorials. The rational dress society had grown out of its infancy and felt emboldened enough to say things like, women should be able to walk unassisted by servants, which was seen as radical. On one curious winter morning in 1893, a satirical column in The Punch depicted a corset not as undergarment, but as malicious character. A fanged creature, clinging to its wearer like a possessive octopus. A caption read, "She adored the style, and the corset adored her lungs," as dinner, even as London's gaslit drawing room shimmered with lace and ladylike suppression. Behind the scenes, more women were quietly questioning the corset's chokehold on their lives. A few began experimenting. They swapped boning for padding, whale baleen for cotton lacing, steel stays for, wait for it, elastic. Elastic, dear listener, was the whisper of freedom in a world of squeaking constraints. But let's not imagine that progress was an overnight event with confetti. No, reform dribbled in politely, offering tea before it spoke its mind. Even doctors who agreed that corsets were troublesome were hesitant to be too direct. After all, this was not yet the era of blunt medical television dramas and candid conversations involving phrases like herniated diaphragm, so instead, they used euphemisms. Oh, the euphemisms. Palpitations, digestive irregularities, a vague sense of internal misalignment, which is medical Latin for your organs have filed a formal complaint and would like to relocate somewhere less corsety. Still, the fashionable crowd was not easily dissuaded. Corsets were not only beauty tools, but symbols of control, status, and decorum. To remove one was to risk accusations of being a new woman, a feared evolutionary leap that seemed to involve voting, bicycling, and saying things like, "I have opinions." And yet, the mood was shifting. Softly, like a piano left open in a warm parlor, as more women began to voice their chest discomfort and their wish to sit down occasionally without fainting, the whispers grew louder. Change wasn't coming at full gallop, but it was certainly trotting, corset laces flapping ever so faintly in the breeze. In the quiet of a stiff-seated drawing room, a governess unhooked her stays a little earlier than usual. In an upstairs corridor, a maid tucked a padded corset under her arm for the first time. And across the pages of the Ladies' Home Journal, a headline gingerly suggested, "On the merits of breathing freely." It was, perhaps, the beginning of something breathing room-shaped, a soft exhale before the loud debate. And as the clock chimed its slightly wheezy ninth note, another paragraph of corseted history began to loosen, ever so gently. In the later Victorian years, when pigeons were still considered viable sources of communication and arsenic was available with slightly less regulation than toothpaste, the corset debate reached a peculiar stage. Its medical theatre. This was an era when doctors still prescribed leeches with a straight face and felt deeply conflicted on whether women should ride bicycles or simply vaporize from the effort. Into this swirling corseted fog strode a curious breed of Victorian physician, part scientist, part social philosopher, and entirely baffled by the female torso. Many among them regarded the corset not merely as clothing, but rather as a moral battleground stitched together with firm boning and laces that whispered of sin, seduction, and a severely compromised digestive tract. Some doctors, with furrowed brows and exceptionally flammable beards, began drawing striking illustrations of the internal organs displaced by corsetry. These diagrams were shown at medical lectures, printed in eccentric pamphlets, and occasionally tacked onto the walls of women's colleges with a sense of urgent Victorian flair. One particularly memorable drawing came from Dr. William Barry, whose 1883 paper included the infamous image of viscera shifted upwards and sideways by fashion herself. It showed the liver somewhere near the shoulder blade, a stomach flattened like a particularly deflated whoopee cushion, and the intestines huddled in the pelvis like children hiding from a thunderstorm. Dr. Barry titled this illustration, "A Warning to Mothers." It is worth noting that Dr. Barry created this illustration without the benefit of X-rays, which wouldn't be invented for over a decade. He relied instead on theories, palpations, and an audacious imagination. Modern scholars have since described this anatomical sketch as more interpretive dance than science, but in the era of such medical ambiguity, it was taken deeply seriously, particularly by women concerned that their bosoms were crushing their lungs into artistic origami. Despite such concerns, corsets maintained their vice-like grip on the fashion of the day. And it's here we meet our next colourful figure, Lady Euphemia Simmons-Lloyd, a spirited campaigner for rational dress and a frequent letter writer to the Times. She once publicly claimed that wearing a corset made her feel as if she were being folded into a picnic hamper by particularly strong butlers. Lady Euphemia had grown tired of fainting during pleasant walks and undertaking meals that resembled Victorian bird feedings. So she launched a small campaign titled Let Waists Be Free, featuring polite protests, anti-corset poetry circles, and a traveling exhibition comparing the corset to various antique torture implements. Her efforts, while lightly mocked in society columns, caught the attention of a few open-minded physicians, including Dr. Llewellyn Faraday Price, a man who described himself as a liberated man of the ribcage. He claimed his observations in a girls' boarding school, where compulsory corset wearing was enforced between piano, practice and sighing, had shown a rise in shallow breathing, academic listlessness, and secreted scones. Citing this, Dr. Faraday Price proposed a new medical diagnosis, compulsive corset constriction syndrome, or CCCS. While never officially endorsed by any medical board, CCCS did achieve a brief cultural buzz, especially when an actress collapsed during the third act of a Shakespeare production and her corset was blamed for constricting her performance. Meanwhile, corset companies engaged in a defensive charm offensive. They introduced ventilated corsets with tiny perforations for airing out the torso, advertised flexiboning with sprung steel guaranteed not to salami the organs, and even promoted health corsets, allegedly designed by actual doctors, though none could be located for interviews. Still, amid all this, the women knew. They knew when their ribs ached after tea. They knew when they could no longer twist to reach a dropped handkerchief or breathe fully, while laughing. They knew the enchantment of looking like a pencil sketch and the exhaustion of living like one. Even Queen Victoria, formidable though diminutive, had corset opinions. Her waist may have been cinched, but her private letters tried, in a roundabout way, to encourage her daughters toward moderation. Etiquette must make way for ease, she once wrote, though her handwriting suggested she was dictating while wrestling her own corset during that line. So there it was. Doctors, duchesses, and dainty revolters swirled together in a fog of lace and lecture. The corset's hold on fashion had begun to fray, not snapped, but loosened, ever so slightly. The body, that most silent of revolutionaries, had spoken in gasps and slumps and digestive protest. And in the quiet that followed, whether in drawing rooms or doctors' offices, the question lingered like lavender cologne in a too-warm salon. Must beauty always inhale with such difficulty? The answer tiptoes closer, in the hush of lace and bone. Come, let us trace one last ribbon through the twilight. There, nestled delicately in the final decades of Queen Victoria's spectacularly corseted reign, lay the curious twilight of the corset's golden age. As gaslights flickered and steam trains sighed through the countryside like polite dragons, the stiff-boned undergarment remained firmly laced around the collective midsection of society. But beyond the drawing rooms and debutante balls, a quiet rebellion was brewing, one whispered between teacups and sewn into bloomers. Victorian women, ever ingenious despite their tightly cinched circumstances, had begun to suspect that perhaps being shaped like a wasp was not, in fact, the pinnacle of anatomical destiny. Physicians, especially the ones with crinkly eyes and tweedy jackets with biscuit crumbs in the pockets, were issuing increasingly dramatic warnings. According to their journals, verbose, alarmist, and quite possibly gin-fueled, the corset could cause displaced wombs, collapsed lungs, and what one imaginative doctor ominously termed nervous disorder of the fashionable type. Such a diagnosis, one imagines, came with a sigh and a prescription for fainting couches and perhaps a light walk in the conservatory. A particularly theatrical physician named Dr. William Henry Flower, a man whose name sounds like a bouquet with a medical degree, launched crusades against tight lacing with flair. He warned that corsets could deform the ribcage and push organs into unnatural arrangements. To demonstrate this, he once brought along a selection of altered skeletons to his lectures, women's thoracic structures bent and pinched like the inner workings of an accordion left in the rain. By Victorian standards, this was deeply scandalous, almost as daring as showing an ankle. Still, fashion was a stubborn tide. For every warning about internal rearrangement, there were illustrators drawing hourglass silhouettes in the latest Paris sketches, and society's whispers insisting that a girl's prospects hinged on the 4-inch gap between her stays. Corsets were, at their core, about control, of posture, of presentation, of propriety. Breathing room was, understandably, an afterthought. Of course, just beneath this rib-squeeze status game bubbled the reformers, rational dress advocates, artists, early feminists, and women with rebellious lungs. They gathered in drawing rooms with looser bodices, sipping tea and daring to suggest, what if women could stand up straight without scaffolding? What if a deep breath didn't carry moral implications? Slowly, gently, change began to unfurl like a dropped petticoat. By the turn of the century, alternatives emerged: the liberty bodice, the reform corset, bloomers, even early prototypes of the brassiere, each one a fabric sigh of relief. The great unfastening had begun. The press caught on naturally. Victorian tabloids, precursors to today's streaming chaos, described the end of the corset with equal parts horror and titillation. Would society collapse without the guiding framework of whalebone? Would morals unravel if women could bend freely at the waist and exhale in public? And yet, as history often does, it quietly marched in sensible shoes toward modernity. The corset, once laced with such symbolic and literal tension, faded. It found refuge mostly in theatrical wardrobes, period dramas, and the occasional goth wedding. It didn't vanish overnight, of course. Nothing in fashion ever truly does. There were echoes of its silhouette drifting into the 20th century, in flapper curves, in girdles, and in Spanx with suspiciously stern constitutions. But the Victorian corset, with all its drama, ambition, and organ-jostling bravado, had passed its prime. And so, dear listener, we leave the last buttons unfastened and the last stays untied. The ladies have taken their last careful step down the staircase. In bustled silk, the doctors have closed their medical sketchbooks, and even the corsetiers are folding away their tape measures with wistful sighs, perhaps dreaming of a world where tailoring no longer involved rib compression. The lights dim across an era of elegance, of empire, of pastel parlors and rigid expectations. And as you drift from this world of lace and lacing, this beautiful, baffling ballet of fashion and folly, may you find comfort in knowing that history, like sleep, often loosens its grip in the quiet hours. Now rest, gentle mind, and let the layers of the past settle gently around you, not too snug. Breathe deeply, dream freely, and sleep.